In the northern reaches of ancient Greece lay a land once dismissed by its neighbors as barbaric Macedonia. But in the 4th century BC, under the rule of King Philip II, a former hostage in Thebes, he had studied firsthand the tactics of Greek warfare. Returning to Macedonia, he reformed his army with cold precision. He introduced the sarissa, a 16-foot-long spear. His mother, Olympias, claimed descent from Achilles himself, and she filled her son's mind with tales of divine lineage and destiny. He summoned one of the greatest minds of the ancient world to be his son's suitor, Aristotle. At just 18, he played a decisive role at the Battle of Chaeronea, where Philip crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. Alexander's charge shattered the elite Theban sacred band. His eyes were fixed eastward, across the Hellespont where the mighty Persian Empire loomed. The empire that had once tried and failed to conquer Greece. But the world would soon come to know the son, not as a king. The message was clear. The boy was born for war. Under his guidance, Alexander studied philosophy, medicine, ethics, poetry, and science. During a celebration in Egypt, Philip was stabbed by one of his own bodyguards. Rumors swirled, implicating court rivals, even Olympias. Whatever the truth, Alexander acted with swift brutality. At just 20 years old, he eliminated all threats to his throne. Noble rivals were executed, and dissent was crushed. He read Homer's Iliad as if it were scripture, sleeping with a copy under his pillow. Achilles became his role model in conquest, his purpose. From his earliest years, Alexander believed he was meant for greatness, not as a prince, but as a legend, and trained his soldiers in a brutal, disciplined phalanx formation. With these innovations and a talent for diplomacy and ruthlessness alike, Philip united the fractured Macedonian tribes and conquered much of Greece through a mix of force and political manipulation. This kingdom would rise from obscurity and forge the greatest military machine the Greek world had ever seen. Philip was no ordinary monarch, but behind every great king stands a greater legacy, and in Philip's case, it was his son, Alexander. Born in 356 BC in the capital city of Pella, Alexander was no ordinary child. To prepare him, Philip spared no expense. By his teenage years, Alexander was already leading cavalry in battle. But in 336 BC, destiny struck. The boy king was now the supreme ruler of Macedonia and commander of the most advanced army in the world. But he wasn't content with ruling Greece. Now Alexander would return the favor. His father had laid the foundation, but as a conqueror. When Alexander ascended the throne in 336 BC, the ancient world watched with bated breath. A mere 20-year-old, fresh-faced and untested as a ruler, now commanded the greatest army in Greece. But with Philip dead, many believed Macedonia would splinter and its enemies would pounce. They were wrong. No sooner had the crown settled on Alexander's head than rebellion stirred across Greece. The city of Thebes, emboldened by Macedon's moment of weakness, openly defied him. Athens hesitated, watching from a distance. Sparta remained silent but watchful. When he reached Thebes, he offered them mercy, surrender, and peace. But Thebes refused, underestimating the young king. It would be their final mistake. The Persian Empire, ever eager to destabilize Greek unity, offered encouragement from across the Aegean. Across Greece, city-states bowed in silence. Even Sparta, famously independent, stayed out of Alexander's way. Ruled by King Darius III, it commanded immense wealth, vast armies, and ancient cities filled with gold and glory. The young king had proven he wasn't just his father's heir, he was a force unto himself. To unite the Greek world under the banner of a pan-Hellenic crusade and strike deep into Asia, including Macedonian phalanx infantry, elite hypaspists, seasoned cavalry, and allied Greek contingents. Legend tells that when he arrived, he visited the ancient city of Troy, paid tribute at the tomb of Achilles, and took up a shield said to be his hero's. He appointed his loyal general Parmenion to command the veteran officers. Behind them stood a supply line stretching back to Macedonia, and ahead, the unknown. He called it revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece a century earlier, but it was much more than that. Then, with chilling finality, Alexander gave the order: the city was to be destroyed. Over 30,000 citizens were sold into slavery. Only the house of the poet Pindar was spared, perhaps a gesture to culture, or a warning cloaked in irony. But Alexander moved with speed and ferocity. He marched south, not giving the rebels time to organize. In one of the swiftest sieges in ancient history, Alexander's army stormed the city. His elite companion cavalry crushed resistance. Thebes fell in days. Thousands were killed. The message was loud and clear: defiance would not be tolerated. Athens quickly submitted. With Greece firmly under control, Alexander turned to the project that had long obsessed his father: the invasion of the Persian Empire. At its height, Persia was a colossus, a superpower stretching from Asia Minor to India, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. But Persia was also growing weak. Its vastness bred corruption. Satraps, provincial governors, acted like independent kings. And Darius, though noble-born, lacked the charisma of a warrior. Alexander's plan was simple but daring. In 334 BC, Alexander assembled a force of roughly 40,000 troops. Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait dividing Europe from Asia. He was not just marching to war. He was marching into myth. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander stepped onto the shores of Asia Minor, leading a combined Macedonian and Greek force of around 40,000 men. It was symbolic. He was crossing into the land of the Persian Empire, once a monstrous force that had tried to crush Greece under Xerxes and Darius I. But now, a Greek king would march on Persia itself. With him were hardened veterans of Philip's campaigns, noble officers like Parmenion, Craterus, and Philotas, and his personal guard, the elite companion cavalry, fierce and loyal. His arrival wasn't just a military move. One of his first acts upon landing was dramatic and deliberate. He hurled a spear into the ground and declared he had come to claim Asia as his by right of conquest. His companion cavalry followed, driving straight into the Persian ranks. The river crossing turned into a bloodbath, chaotic and muddy, with clashing horses and screaming men. Greek cities in Ionia, long under Persian rule, began to rise in rebellion or surrender outright. The war had officially begun, not just a war of armies, but of civilizations. In each city, he abolished tyrannies, declared freedom, and left behind small garrisons to maintain order. It was both military strategy and psychological warfare. He was not just a destroyer, he was a liberator of the Greek spirit. Ahead lay the heart of Asia, the mighty cities of Sardis, Ephesus, and eventually Persepolis. Waiting for him were local Persian satraps, provincial governors, who had assembled a force near the Granicus River in western Asia Minor. Though small compared to the full might of the Persian Empire, their army included thousands of Persian cavalry and a large contingent of Greek mercenaries, hardened soldiers hired to fight for the highest bidder. Alexander could have waited. The river's steep banks made it dangerous to cross in the face of the enemy. Even his generals urged caution. But Alexander was never cautious. He led the charge himself, crossing the river under heavy missile fire. At one point, Alexander was nearly killed. A Persian noble raised his sword for a killing blow, but Cletus the Black, one of his loyal officers, struck the man down in time. The Greek mercenaries, abandoned by their employers, fought bravely but were surrounded and slaughtered almost to the last man. Once the cavalry broke through, Macedonian infantry crossed the river and swept aside the remaining resistance. The Persian satraps fled. The Battle of Granicus was a decisive Macedonian victory. In one stroke, Alexander had secured the western edge of Asia Minor. Persian morale was shattered. But Alexander did not just conquer, he liberated, or so he claimed. Still, the Persian Empire was far from defeated. This was only the beginning. And far in the distance, in the halls of his empire, King Darius III had heard the name Alexander for the first time. He would not forget it. After the victory at the Granicus River, Alexander moved quickly. His strategy was simple: gain control of Asia Minor's coastline, cut off Persian naval power. To Alexander's surprise, the city surrendered without a fight. Its garrison, perhaps rattled by news of Granicus, offered the city keys to the young conqueror. Alexander responded with a clever touch. He respected local traditions, spared the population, and left behind a Macedonian commander to oversee the transition, and push inland through city after city, each one a stepping stone deeper into the empire. First came Sardis, one of the wealthiest cities in the region and a Persian administrative hub. He continued south through Ephesus, where he was greeted as a liberator. The people rose against their Persian-aligned rulers. Its Persian commander, Memnon of Rhodes, a brilliant Greek mercenary general, had fortified the city and prepared for siege. There, in the palace of a long-dead king, stood an ox cart tied with a complex knot, the Gordian knot. Legend claimed that whoever could untie it would become the ruler of all Asia, and Alexander abolished oligarchic rule, reinstating democratic governance. He also funded the reconstruction of the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, gaining admiration and loyalty from the locals. But not every city welcomed him. Walls were bombarded with catapults and battering rams. Persian coastal power had been crippled. Local populations were under his control. And his men, many of whom had marched with his father, now saw in him something even greater. Fires broke out. And for the first time, King Darius III himself would enter the war. The defenders launched desperate sorties, but Alexander's persistence paid off. Eventually, the Persians burned the city and retreated, and Alexander took the smoking ruins. Halicarnassus, a major coastal stronghold and home to the famous mausoleum, resisted fiercely. Alexander laid siege to Halicarnassus for weeks. In these rugged, mountainous regions, many towns surrendered quickly. Alexander's policy remained consistent. He respected local customs, allowed religious freedom, and distributed Persian treasure among his soldiers. He was building more than an army, he was forging a legend. Though it was a symbolic victory, it had cost him time and resources. Still, Alexander had demonstrated he could adapt. He wasn't just a battlefield commander, but also a siege master, learning from every engagement. With Halicarnassus taken, he began his march through Lycia, Pamphylia, and Pisidia. In Phrygia, he arrived at the city of Gordium, home to a strange and ancient prophecy. According to the tale, Alexander stared at the knot, then pulled out his sword and cut it in two. "It makes no difference how it is undone," he reportedly said. The story was more than a myth. It was a declaration. Alexander would not be bound by tradition or fate. He would shape destiny by force. By 333 BC, just 1 year into his campaign, Alexander had secured all of Western Asia Minor, but ahead, beyond the Taurus Mountains, a vast Persian army was gathering. In the autumn of 333 BC, Alexander's campaign entered its most dangerous phase yet. Having secured Asia Minor, Alexander led his army eastward, across the rugged Taurus Mountains, pushing into Cilicia, a narrow strip of land wedged between the sea and the cliffs. The terrain was brutal, the weather punishing. Many of his troops grew sick from the cold, and Alexander himself suffered a life-threatening fever. But he recovered quickly, famously insisting on leading from the front, even when ill. Meanwhile, far to the east, Darius III, king of Persia, had finally decided to act. Its 18-foot spears bristling like a wall of iron. On his right flank, he led the elite companion cavalry, supported by archers and light infantry. His attack cut through the lines like a spear. As he pressed forward, he got within sight of Darius himself riding in a gilded chariot, surrounded by royal guards. Parmenion held the left, bracing for the massive Persian cavalry charge. He raised a massive army, over 100,000 men, some say even more, drawn from every corner of the empire. Persian cavalry, targeting Alexander's center and left. More importantly, Darius' family, his mother, wife, and daughters, were captured in the royal camp. The fighting was fierce, brutal hand-to-hand combat in the mud and shallows. He refused to harm them and even ensured they were addressed by their royal titles. But Alexander held the line. Syrian archers, Indian war chariots, and elite immortals, the Persian royal guard. It was a force meant to crush the Macedonian invasion and end the upstart-esque campaign for good. But Darius made a critical mistake. Instead of waiting in the open plains of Mesopotamia, where his numerical superiority could dominate, at a narrow coastal plain hemmed in by mountains and the Panaris River, the geography neutralized Darius' greatest strength, his numbers. His vast army was now crammed into a small space, unable to maneuver freely. He took his army north, maneuvering behind Alexander's position. The two armies unknowingly passed each other in the night. When Alexander realized Darius was now behind him, he made a bold decision. He would not retreat. He would turn around, march north, and confront the king of Persia head-on. They met near the town of Issus. Alexander saw his chance. He placed the Macedonian phalanx in the center. Darius began the battle by sending waves of troops across the river. Then came the masterstroke. Alexander led a thunderous cavalry charge directly into the gap between the Persian infantry and Darius' personal guard. What happened next became legend. Darius, seeing the Macedonian king charging toward him, panicked. He turned his chariot and fled the battlefield, his massive army following in chaos. It was a complete rout. The Persians lost tens of thousands. Macedonian casualties were minimal, but Alexander treated them with dignity and respect. The message was clear. Alexander was not a barbarian. He was a king, and more, he was becoming a ruler of empires. After his stunning victory at Issus, Alexander controlled the eastern Mediterranean coast. But he knew the war was far from over. Darius had escaped. And though he offered peace, promising to give Alexander vast territories in exchange for halting his invasion, Alexander refused. He would not settle. He would conquer it all. But before pushing deep into the Persian heartland, he turned south, toward the rich cities of Phoenicia, Palestine, and ultimately Egypt. His goal was clear: eliminate Persia's naval power and secure his southern flank. Many cities welcomed him. The Phoenician ports of Byblus and Sidon surrendered without a fight, grateful to be freed from Persian control. But Tyre, the jewel of Phoenicia, a fortified island city surrounded by high sea walls, resisted. He built a fleet by commandeering ships from conquered ports and blockaded Tyre from all sides. It would become one of Alexander's most grueling sieges. Day by day, his men dragged stones, logs, and rubble into the sea under constant attack from Tyrian ships. Unable to storm the city by sea, Alexander ordered the construction of a massive causeway, a land bridge, to connect the mainland to the island. The Tyrians countered fiercely, setting fire to siege towers and unleashing flaming ships. But Alexander responded with greater intensity. Thousands of Tyrians were killed, and the survivors were enslaved. The city was taken not just by force, but by sheer, relentless will. A center of learning, commerce, and culture for centuries to come. After 7 months, Alexander's army breached the walls. The assault was brutal. To consult the Oracle of Amun, a powerful religious site believed to be connected to the gods. Some say that priests hailed him as the son of Zeus Ammon, confirming his divine status. Others believe he asked whether he was truly the son of Philip or of a god. From there, he marched south. The Egyptian people, long resentful of Persian domination, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. Gaza, another fortified city, also resisted and suffered the same fate. But when Alexander reached Egypt, something extraordinary happened. The Persian king was rallying the might of the East for one last stand. The Persians had ruled the land for over a century, and their governors fled at the first sign of his approach, where he was crowned pharaoh son of Ra, the living god. In 332 BC, he entered Memphis, the ancient capital, to solidify his legacy. He founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. It would become one of the greatest cities in history. But the most symbolic moment of his time in Egypt came when he journeyed across the desert to the Siwa oasis. What the oracle told him remains a mystery. Alexander never revealed what was said. But from that moment on, he no longer called himself merely a king. He began to see himself as divinely chosen, a man of destiny. And with Egypt secure, the stage was set for the final confrontation. Ahead beyond the deserts and mountains, at Gaugamela. In 331 BC, Alexander marched once again, this time toward the very heart of the Persian Empire. Darius III, humiliated at Issus and desperate to protect his throne, had assembled the greatest army the East had ever seen. From every corner of his vast dominion came warriors: Persians, Medes, Scythians, Bactrians, Indians, and even war elephants. He had it cleared and leveled to favor his cavalry and chariots. His plan: overwhelm Alexander with numbers, crush his flanks, and reclaim his empire in one decisive blow. This would be the final stand, Gaugamela. Darius had carefully chosen the battlefield, a flat, open plain near the village of Gaugamela in modern-day Iraq. Alexander arrived with calculated determination. He studied the terrain. He reorganized his troops. He spent the night before the battle in calm meditation, while Darius stayed awake, fearful of what the dawn would bring. Then attacked the riders from the sides and rear. On the morning of the battle, the sun rose over an anxious field. Alexander gave a rousing speech to his men, reminding them that though they were outnumbered, they had skill, discipline, and destiny on their side. The Macedonian army formed up, phalanxes in the center, cavalry on the flanks, light infantry and archers spread to respond. Alexander commanded the right, Parmenion the left. Then, in a sudden burst, he led the companion cavalry in a wedge formation, punching straight through the weakened Persian line. Then the battle began. Darius unleashed his war chariots, spiked wheels thundering across the plain. But Alexander had anticipated them. His troops opened lanes, let the chariots pass. He turned and fled, just as he had at Issus. And instead of pursuing Darius, he turned back to rescue his own men, another mark of his leadership. Ambition, tempered with loyalty. Darius escaped once more, but his empire was shattered. The treasuries of the East now belonged to him. In a single day, he had become the master of the known world. As the Persians surged forward, Alexander executed a brilliant maneuver. He extended his right flank diagonally, drawing the Persian cavalry away from the center. Alexander now set his sights on the farthest reaches of the earth, to the edge of India, where new enemies and unknown lands awaited. He aimed directly for Darius. The Persian king saw the Macedonian cavalry hurtling toward him and panicked again. With their king gone, the Persian army collapsed. But the battle wasn't over. On the left, Parmenian's troops were nearly overwhelmed. The Persian cavalry had pushed deep into his ranks. Word reached Alexander. By nightfall, the Persian army had disintegrated. Tens of thousands lay dead. The spoils of Gaugamela were immense. Babylon, Susa, and eventually Persepolis, the royal capital of Persia, would fall to Alexander. But he didn't stop there. Driven by a vision that extended beyond empires. With the victory at Gaugamela, Alexander had crushed the last organized resistance of the Persian Empire. But one man still stood in his way, Darius III. The defeated king fled eastward, hoping to rally support from the eastern satraps. But his credibility was shattered. One by one, governors abandoned him. Even his closest generals began to doubt. Among them was Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, who had his own ambitions for power. As Alexander marched deeper into Persia, he was greeted as a conqueror, but also as a king. At Babylon, the priests welcomed him with ceremony. At Susa, he took possession of immense Persian treasuries, glittering with unimaginable wealth. But his most symbolic prize awaited him, Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid Empire. Persepolis stood as a monument to Persian power, massive halls, towering columns, and reliefs of kings and tribute from every corner of the empire. For centuries, it had been a symbol of Persian supremacy. Others say it was planned. Now it was Alexander's. But with that victory came a moment that would haunt his legacy. After entering Persepolis, Alexander allowed his troops to loot the city, a calculated act of revenge for Persia's past invasion of Greece under Xerxes, who had burned Athens 150 years earlier. Gold and silver were taken by the ton. Slaves were chained. When Alexander arrived, he found the dying king abandoned on the roadside. And then, in a drunken celebration, came the fire. He even vowed revenge on his killers, not as a conqueror of Persia, but as its new ruler. Persia's heart was ash, who urged him to take vengeance by burning the Persian palace to the ground. Inspired by wine and the moment, Alexander threw the first torch. The Persian Empire had fallen, but Alexander's ambitions had not. Voice softens. Some say it was an accident. One story tells of a courtesan named Thais, a companion of Alexander. The great palace of Xerxes caught fire. Flames spread quickly, lighting the night sky as marble cracked and priceless scrolls turned to ash. For hours, the city burned an inferno, consuming centuries of art, culture, and empire. When the sun rose, all that remained was smoke and rubble. Alexander would later regret the act, seeing it not as a symbol of conquest, but of destruction. Yet it was done. Meanwhile, Darius' fate was sealed. Bessus, now viewing Darius as a liability, betrayed and murdered him in the mountains of modern-day Iran. With great ceremony, he honored Darius as a fellow monarch, giving him a royal burial. And so, with Darius dead, Alexander was no longer a foreign invader. He was now the king of Asia, but the fire of conquest still burned. Ahead lay the mysterious lands of the Indus Valley, and the dream of reaching the ends of the world. By 330 BC, Persia was his. The great cities had fallen. The last king was dead. Alexander had seized the wealth of an empire and crowned himself its ruler. But he was not finished. To many of his men, the war had been won. But for Alexander, victory was just the beginning. Ahead lay the wild, untamed lands of Central Asia, places that even Persian kings had struggled to control. Remote mountains, vast steppes, and fiercely independent tribes awaited him. And somewhere in the east, his old enemy Bessus, the traitor who killed Darius, was still on the run. Roads disappeared. Warriors known as the Sogdians launched guerrilla attacks from mountain fortresses. In the craggy heights of Sogdiana, Alexander faced some of his toughest challenges yet. Supplies grew scarce, but Alexander pushed forward with relentless energy. He built roads, established garrisons, and founded new cities, all while chasing Bessus deeper into the wilderness. He fell in love, and against the expectations of his generals, married her, a political move, but also a personal one. So Alexander marched on, who handed him over to avoid the conqueror's wrath. He even began encouraging intermarriage between his men and native women, blending Greek and Eastern cultures into one vision, a united empire under his rule. In a show of imperial justice, Alexander had Bessus publicly tried, flogged, and executed. He declared himself heir not only to Darius, but to the throne of all Asia, his growing belief in his own divinity, and his refusal to return home. He crossed the Zagros Mountains into Media, then swept through Parthia, and finally reached Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan. The terrain was brutal. Eventually, Bessus was captured, not by Alexander, but by his own allies. Yet resistance in these eastern lands did not end with Bessus. Tribal rebellions broke out constantly, but he adapted. He split his forces into smaller, faster units. He fought in the dead of winter. He scaled cliffs to take fortresses thought impregnable. In one bold assault, he personally led a surprise attack on the Sogdian Rock, a stronghold perched on a steep mountain. When the defenders mocked him, saying he would need men with wings, Alexander sent his best climbers up the cliffs at night. At dawn, they appeared above the walls wingless but victorious. Voice softens briefly, then swells with romance. It was here, amid the conquest of Sogdiana, that Alexander met Roxana, a noble woman of extraordinary beauty and spirit. For the first time, Alexander wasn't just conquering new lands. He was becoming part of them. He adopted Persian dress. He included local nobles in his administration, but not all his soldiers were pleased. Whispers of resentment grew. Some Macedonians questioned his new ways. Still, Alexander pressed eastward, toward the next great river, toward India. Beyond the mountains of Central Asia lay a land shrouded in mystery. To the Greeks, it was the edge of the known world India, a place of vast rivers, strange beasts, and powerful kings. For them, this was uncharted territory, lush, humid, filled with monsoons and exotic dangers. But Alexander moved with typical precision. Alexander had heard legends of its gold, its wisdom, and its warriors, and now nothing would stop him from reaching it. 2. Some Indian rulers submitted peacefully, bringing gifts and troops to join the march. In 327 BC, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush, entering the Indian subcontinent. His army, though weary, followed. He subdued rebellious hill tribes and founded cities along the way, securing supply routes and establishing control. Diplomacy played a role. Ruler of the region between the Jhelum and Chenab rivers in modern-day Punjab, Porus was no petty chieftain. He commanded a large, disciplined army, including a terrifying new weapon, war elephants. But not all. Word soon reached Alexander, a mighty king to the east Porus. The two titans met at the Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BC. Tone shifts, tense, suspenseful. It was monsoon season. The river swelled with rain. Porus stationed his army on the opposite bank, confident Alexander couldn't cross without being slaughtered. But Alexander, as always, outmaneuvered him. By dawn, he appeared on Porus's flank unexpected and ready to strike. Under the cover of darkness and a thunderstorm, he led a small elite force upstream, crossing the river with rafts and quiet precision, and even gave him more territory to rule under Macedonian authority. Porus responded quickly, sending his war elephants into battle. The ground shook as the beasts charged. And Alexander's men, after years of war, over 11,000 miles from home, had reached their limit. Macedonian horses panicked. Confused and wounded, the beasts turned on their own lines. The Macedonians pressed forward with relentless discipline. And when Porus's army broke, Alexander captured the Indian king, but what happened next would define his legend. The air filled with the roar of animals and the screams of men. It was the first time Alexander had faced such monsters in open battle, but his troops held firm. Using javelins and precise coordination, they targeted the mahouts, or elephant drivers. Tone softens, noble, reflective. Brought before Alexander in chains, Porus was asked how he wished to be treated. He replied, like a king. Impressed by his courage and dignity, Alexander did exactly that. He freed Porus, restored his kingdom. It was an act of both strategy and respect, one that won him allies across the region. But the cost of the campaign was high. The battle had been brutal, the rains endless. They refused to go further east. Alexander, though furious, relented. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, he turned back, not in defeat, but in recognition that even his ambition had its limits. He would return through the deserts of the south toward Babylon, toward the final chapter of his extraordinary life. In 326 BC, after years of relentless conquest, Alexander stood at the eastern edge of the world. But instead of glory, he faced a bitter truth. His army had had enough. They had fought countless battles, crossed mountains, rivers, and deserts. They missed their homes, their families, their country. But Alexander, perhaps seeking to match or surpass the feats of Persian kings like Cyrus, chose the challenge deliberately. The men refused to march farther into India. Alexander was furious. For the first time, his iron will met open resistance. But after days of silence and tears, he relented. He turned his back on the east and ordered the return journey, not through the safer northern route, but through a southern path that would become one of the most harrowing trials of his entire campaign, the Gedrosian Desert. A barren, sun-scorched wasteland stretching across what is now southern Pakistan and Iran. No Greek army had ever crossed it. Few local traders even dared. He refused water unless his soldiers could drink too. He marched on foot beside them. He buried the dead. Still, nothing could shield them from the brutal desert. He killed Cletus the Black, a trusted friend, in a drunken rage, then wept for days with guilt. Sandstorms, salt plains where no fresh water flowed, of exploring the outer oceans. Starving men fell by the hundreds. Horses and pack animals died, but a man who had endured hell with his troops and lived to tell the tale. Their bones bleaching in the sun, supplies ran low. Wells dried up. The unforgiving terrain broke the army, piece by piece. He had grown more distant, more regal, adopting Eastern customs, demanding prostration, calling himself the son of Zeus. Many of his men, especially the older Macedonians, began to resent what they saw as vanity. Voice intensifies with tension and dread. It was a disaster. Blistering heat. Alexander did not escape the suffering. Some estimates say thousands perished more than in any of his battles. It was not conquest. It was survival. The new capital of his empire. By the time they reached the safety of Carmania, the army was in tatters. But Alexander's legend had grown, not just a brilliant general. Tone softens, weary but determined. Now back in Persia, Alexander returned to Babylon, but he was not the same man who had set out from Macedonia. Years of war had changed him. Alexander responded with cruelty. He executed officers who questioned him, and still, he dreamed of more. He began planning new expeditions to Arabia, perhaps even to Carthage and Rome one day. He spoke of circumnavigating Africa, but time was catching up with him. His body, worn down by wounds, fevers, and exhaustion, was weakening. The greatest conqueror the world had ever known was nearing his end. It was June 323 BC in Babylon. The city bustled with activity. Plans were in motion for new campaigns: Arabia, North Africa, even the distant Western Ocean. Alexander, now 32 years old, stood at the height of his power, ruling an empire that stretched from Greece to India. But behind the splendor, cracks had begun to form. The army was exhausted. The old Macedonian officers grumbled about his eastern habits, his divine claims, and his increasing paranoia. His court grew full of whispers and fear, perhaps from the marshes of Babylon, or the wounds that had never truly healed. Some said it was malaria. Others whispered poison, a plot by his generals or his enemies. Friends were gone, many executed, others dead in battle. His body bore the marks of wounds, illness, and relentless travel. And then he fell ill. He could no longer stand. His body burned with heat, yet he felt cold. His commanders gathered around his bed, hoping for a word, a sign. The people waited outside the palace, silent and terrified. At first, it seemed like a fever. Alexander grew weaker by the day. He lost his voice. Still, he lingered. For 11 days, the most powerful man on earth faded. There was no heir. His only son, Alexander IV, had not yet been born, and his half-brother Aridius was mentally unfit to rule. A grand funeral procession was planned to carry him to Macedonia, but his body was hijacked and taken to Egypt, where it rested in Alexandria, his namesake city. Its location remains unknown to this day. At last, as death crept closer, his generals asked the question that would shape the world for generations to come. To whom do you leave the empire? Ruled by his former generals, the Diadochi, each hungry for power, none able to fill his shadow. Alexander, barely able to speak, is said to have whispered, "To the strongest." Others claimed he said, "To Krotoroi, to Krotros," his most loyal general. But no clear succession followed. The greatest empire the world had ever seen was left in chaos. And on June 10, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. He was just 32 years old. His body was preserved in honey and placed in a magnificent golden sarcophagus. Over time, his tomb vanished. His empire did not survive him. Within a generation, it had splintered into warring kingdoms, but Alexander's legacy endured. In cities he founded, in cultures he united, in legends he inspired. No king, no conqueror, no warrior had ever accomplished what he did in just over a decade. And none have since. When Alexander died in 323 BC, he left behind no clear successor, only an empire stretched thin, stitched together by ambition and military might. But while his empire crumbled, his legacy endured. Not just in military history, but in culture, science, language, and the very fabric of East and West. Alexander's conquests had done something no one had achieved before he connected the known world. From Greece to Egypt, from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, he left behind more than garrisons and governors. He built cities, over 20 of them bearing his name, the most famous of which was Alexandria in Egypt. Alexandria became a beacon of learning, home to the great library, the museum, and scholars from every corner of the empire. Greek became the lingua franca across these lands, a bridge language that would remain dominant for centuries. This was the birth of the Hellenistic era, a time when Greek culture, language, art, and science merged with Egyptian, Persian, and Indian traditions. Alexander didn't just conquer lands. He fused worlds. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, and encouraged his officers to take wives from the east. He blended Greek gods with local deities. In Persia, some called him the new Cyrus, a worthy ruler of the Achaemenid throne. In India, his memory lived on in the tales of powerful foreign kings. Even in Islamic tradition centuries later, he was remembered as Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a great conqueror mentioned in the Quran. He prayed at Egyptian temples, and in India, he met gymnosophists, naked philosophers who challenged his views on life and kingship. He wore Persian robes alongside his Macedonian armor. To others, a foreign tyrant. To many, he was a liberator. In Egypt, he was welcomed as a pharaoh, a god-king. Few historical figures would ever inspire so many myths. He redrew the map of the ancient world and left behind a legacy that would shape it for thousands of years. His pursuit of glory often came at immense human cost. And his dream of a unified empire dissolved almost instantly after his death, leading to civil wars, betrayals, and the rise of new empires. Of course, Alexander's legacy is not without its shadows. He left devastation in his wake, cities burned, cultures uprooted, thousands killed. Yet no one, not even Julius Caesar, Napoleon, or Genghis Khan, escaped his influence. Caesar wept at the thought of Alexander's achievements. Napoleon studied his tactics obsessively. Modern military academies still teach his campaigns. More than 2 millennia later, his name still echoes through history. Alexander the Great. A boy king who became a god in the eyes of some, a tyrant to others, and a legend to all. In just 13 years. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, he left behind an empire. His half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, was mentally unfit to govern. And so, the question of succession ignited a power struggle that would shape the ancient world for decades. But no clear ruler, now turning on each other for a piece of his shattered empire. His only heir, Alexander IV, the child of Roxana, had not yet been born. These struggles became known as the Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors. At the heart of the conflict were Alexander's closest generals and friends, the men who had followed him across deserts and mountains. Ptolemy seized Egypt and took Alexander's body for burial in Alexandria. Seleucus would eventually claim Babylon and the eastern provinces. Antigonus sought control over Asia Minor, ruling on behalf of the two nominal kings, Philip III and infant Alexander IV. Lysimachus carved out a kingdom in Thrace, where the empire was split again among the Diadochi, each taking titles, satrapies, and armies. Peace never lasted. And Cassander, son of a Macedonian noble, claimed Greece and Macedonia and soon declared himself king. But these men were not just rivals. They were once brothers in arms, now consumed by ambition and betrayal. The first regent, Perdiccas, tried to hold the empire together. He was murdered by his own officers. Now it was open warfare, each Diadochus declaring himself king over his territory. But his central rule was hated. Then came the partition of Triperidicis, Alexander's mother, and had her executed. The cultural fusion Alexander began continued to spread through trade, language, art, and science across the Mediterranean and Near East. Later, he imprisoned Roxana and the young Alexander IV, and around 310 BC, he had them silently murdered, ending the Argead dynasty. Assassinations, alliances, and battles followed. In 317 BC, Cassander captured Olympias, kingdoms rose and fell. None of the successors ever rebuilt Alexander's empire, but in its place, they laid the foundation for the Hellenistic kingdoms. With Alexander's family gone, the generals no longer pretended to protect the empire. The wars lasted over 40 years. Cities were sacked. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, ruled by Ptolemy's descendants, including Cleopatra, centuries later. The Seleucid Empire, stretching from Syria to parts of India. Antigonid Macedonia, the last stronghold of Alexander's homeland. Ironically, the men who had shared his greatest victories could not share his legacy. They had fought beside a legend and spent the rest of their lives fighting over his shadow. And though the wars were brutal, the age of empires had changed forever. Was Alexander truly the greatest general in history? It's a question that has echoed through the centuries, across kingdoms, battlefields, and lecture halls. And the answer depends on how we define greatness. By the numbers, his record is unmatched, undefeated in battle. Conqueror of the largest empire the world had seen by the age of 32. His campaigns spanned over 20,000 miles, often against overwhelming odds. He transformed small Macedon into a superpower and crushed the Persian Empire, the greatest force of the ancient world. His tactics are still studied in military academies today. The hammer and anvil maneuver. The coordinated use of cavalry and phalanx, swift flanking movements, psychological warfare, forced marches, and ruled at times with ruthless paranoia. Alexander was not just a warrior, he was a military innovator, a strategic mind far ahead of his time. But greatness is not measured in victories alone. Alexander's brilliance came at a cost. His pursuit of glory left thousands dead. He burned cities, executed friends. He left no stable empire, no peaceful succession. His death unleashed 4 decades of bloodshed. And though he claimed to unite East and West, his methods were often brutal and unforgiving. Yet despite the chaos, his influence is undeniable. He changed the world, not just by conquering it, but by reshaping it. He planted the seeds of the Hellenistic era, where ideas, languages, and beliefs mixed like never before. He inspired empires that followed: Rome, Byzantium, even Islamic and Persian dynasties. Julius Caesar saw a statue of Alexander in Spain and wept, saying, "The ambition," a symbol of what humanity can achieve and what it risks losing in the process. The sheer, relentless pursuit of something larger than life. At my age, he had conquered the world, and I have done nothing. Napoleon carried Arrian's account of Alexander's campaigns on every campaign of his own. Military legends from Hannibal to Patton to Eisenhower have studied his strategies. Even today, over 2,000 years later, his name carries weight. Statues still stand. His face remains on coins. His legend unshaken. In the end, perhaps it's not the victories alone that make a general great. It's the vision. Alexander was more than a conqueror. He was a dreamer, a force of will. He died young, but he carved his name into history forever. Was he the greatest? That's for each generation to decide. But one thing is certain: the world has never seen another like him.